What if a person you barely remember from your past could be the missing piece to complete your present? Hi, I'm Yuna, and I welcome you to Happiness of Love. Get ready for an exciting story that will leave you amazed. Enjoy the video, and may God bless you and your entire family. Have an amazing day. Emma Carter held a hot frying pan with her hand protected by a worn cloth, as the sweet smell of caramel began to fill the small industrial kitchen. She shouted to the helper next to her, who seemed lost in front of a tray of unfinished desserts. Come on, Nate, we need those pies now. The party starts in 15 minutes. In the chaos of a last-minute catering, Emma moved like an organized storm, each movement meticulously calculated but driven by pure passion. His eyes shone with determination, even as a bead of sweat ran down the side of his face. She was far from the most famous chef in New York, but in Emma's heart, every dish was a potential masterpiece. That night, the event was at an art gallery in Brooklyn, where the city's most influential guests would gather. It was more of a small, temporary job, but for Emma, it was an opportunity to prove her talent, even if no one remembered her name. Across town, Ethan Blake adjusted the buttons on his tailored shirt with meticulous movements, the reflection in the mirror giving him the image of an impeccable, controlled man. Her Manhattan apartment was as quiet as it was sophisticated, with floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the night-lit city skyline. He sighed as he checked the message on his cell phone once more, a reminder from his team that the executive dinner had been cancelled due to a kitchen glitch. Ethan squinted. It wasn't the first time that renowned chefs had failed to adapt their menus to his medical condition. It was frustrating to depend on others for something as basic as food, but her dysautonomia left her few choices. Over the years, Ethan had learned to live in a world that revolved around carefully calculated but never satisfying meals. He remained functional, but the idea of pleasure in eating had become a distant memory. As Emma tried to save the night with her enthusiasm and Ethan faced another lonely and lackluster meal, the two were unaware how their lives were about to collide. Inside the gallery's kitchen, Emma finished the last pie, adjusted her apron and handed over the plate with a tired smile. There it is, perfect as always. Now just serve. Already at the top of his apartment, Ethan grabbed a glass of water and prepared to face another night of solitary work. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but he remained motionless, isolated in his world of control and order. Two lives in opposite rhythms, ready to intersect in a plot that neither of them imagined. The insistent sound of the telephone echoed in the kitchen of the small gallery, interrupting Emma Carter's moment of relief after the event. She wiped her hands on a cloth and answered, her voice still breathless from the rush of work. Hello, this is Emma. On the other end of the line, an events coordinator she knew only by name sounded desperate. The chef who was supposed to lead an exclusive dinner had disappeared at the last minute, and Emma was his only option. Emma hesitated. The idea of facing a rich and demanding client with no time to prepare was a nightmare, but something in her optimistic nature made her accept the challenge. It was a chance, even if risky. Okay, send me the address. I'm going. As the taxi crossed the busy streets of Manhattan, Emma looked out the window, trying to calm her breathing. His mind was racing, reviewing possible dishes that might please without knowing the customer's taste. Who would have a last-minute private dinner on a Tuesday? She thought to herself, imagining a celebrity or some eccentric tycoon. In Ethan Blake's luxurious apartment, the atmosphere was different. He read the message that the replacement chef was on the way with a mix of skepticism and irritation. Another attempt by your team to solve problems without consulting you. Ethan looked at his watch. It wasn't just food, it was his health. Any oversight could result in hours of discomfort or even something more serious. When the doorbell rang, Ethan opened the door and found Emma on the other side, balancing a suitcase of knives and a nervous smile. She said with a touch of humor, Chef Emma Carter, the replacement for the night. I hope you like surprises. Ethan watched her with critical eyes, his rigid posture reflecting the distrust he felt. He noticed the lack of glamour expected from a renowned chef. Inside, he pondered, is this the person who is going to handle my diet? Emma entered, trying to ignore Ethan's analytical gaze as she took in the grandeur of the apartment. Every detail was perfectly organized, reflecting the man who lived there. She commented, in an effort to break the ice, nice place. I imagine your kitchen is even more impressive. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just gestured towards the kitchen, where everything looked untouched, as if it were a magazine set. Emma opened her suitcase, exposing her improvised tools and ingredients. She tried to maintain a cheerful tone. Well, let's get started. Can I ask you a few questions to better understand your preferences and restrictions? Ethan hesitated, but began to explain his condition with technical coolness, describing the symptoms and limitations he faced. Emma listened to him carefully, realizing that his rigid posture hid something deeper, tiredness and isolation. Throughout the night, Emma worked with concentration, adjusting recipes in real time, guided by her intuition. Ethan watched from afar, curious but cautious. The aroma that began to fill the kitchen was different from what he expected, comforting, yet sophisticated. When she served the final dish, a lightly grilled fish with mashed sweet potatoes and a citrus reduction, Ethan looked at the meal skeptically. Emma encouraged him with a smile. "Try it. I promise you won't regret it." Ethan took a piece to his mouth, expecting the same blandness that marked his usual meals. But the taste surprised him. It was balanced, delicate, but with a complexity he hadn't experienced in years. He didn't say anything immediately, but Emma noticed the softening of his expression. While cleaning the kitchen, Emma casually commented, "I hope I met your expectations. It was a bit improvised, but I did the best I could." Ethan responded after a long pause, "It was different. But in a good way." Ethan wouldn't admit it out loud, but something about Emma's approach intrigued him. Maybe it was the relaxed way she approached the task, or the fact that, for the first time in a long time, he felt cared for. He watched her as she collected her things, already thinking about the possibility of keeping her close, even temporarily. Emma arrived at Ethan Blake's apartment the next morning with the same suitcase of knives, but this time accompanied by a greater feeling of nervousness. Despite Ethan's reluctant tone the night before, he had asked her to come back. The opportunity seemed promising, but there was something in his manner, in his rigid posture and meticulous gaze, that made it clear he was not easy to please. Ethan received her with an almost imperceptible wave, already dressed in his impeccable shirt and neutral expression. His apartment, once again, seemed like a reflection of his personality, organized, almost sterile, with no room for mistakes or improvisations. Ethan led Emma into the kitchen, speaking in a controlled tone. "Here are my diet guidelines. I want something simple, but I needed to follow the specifications exactly." He placed a thick file on the counter, filled with detailed notes and restrictions. Emma opened the pages, reading quickly as Ethan watched her, expecting to find hesitation or irritation. Instead, she smiled lightly. "Nothing like a challenge to start the day," he said with a carefree tone, but internally he felt the weight of responsibility. The first task was to prepare breakfast. Emma set to work carefully, choosing ingredients and adjusting measurements precisely. As he cut fruit and cooked grains in a pot, Ethan hovered in the background, arms crossed and eyes watchful, as if he were evaluating every move. For him, this wasn't just a meal, it was a question of control. After years of failed attempts with chefs who didn't understand the seriousness of his condition, he couldn't allow mistakes. However, there was something about Emma's manner that disconcerted him. She didn't seem nervous under his critical gaze. On the contrary, he seemed to be enjoying himself, humming a soft tune as he mixed ingredients. "Do you always sing while you work?" Ethan's question cut through the silence, surprising Emma. She looked at him for a moment before responding with a smile. "Only when I'm comfortable in the kitchen. And it's my way of keeping stress away." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Stress? It doesn't seem like you're under pressure." Emma laughed softly. "Oh, but I am. I just know how to disguise it well." When breakfast was served, Ethan analyzed the dish meticulously before tasting it. It was a quinoa porridge with red fruits and a touch of honey, presented elegantly. He tasted a spoonful and found that, once again, the flavor was surprisingly balanced. But Ethan didn't express approval, he just nodded slightly and continued eating. Emma noticed the restrained reaction, but didn't let it affect her. For her, the challenge was more than pleasing a demanding client. It was an opportunity to understand a man who seemed to have built a wall around himself. Over the next few days, the dynamic between them began to define itself. Ethan maintained his distant and controlled posture, pointing out every detail that didn't meet his expectations. "This fruit is a little too acidic. The sauce is good, but could be lighter." Emma listened attentively, but responded firmly, without losing her good humor. Once, when Ethan complained that a dish was a degree off, Emma laughed and said, "Looks like you have an internal thermometer." Ethan looked at her with an expression that bordered on amusement, but quickly returned to his serious tone. "I prefer to call it attention to detail." Meanwhile, Emma began to notice patterns in Ethan's behavior. He avoided any physical contact, maintained an extremely strict routine, and rarely showed emotion. But there were times when his mask of control slipped, like when she cooked something he really enjoyed, and he hesitated before offering a discreet compliment. Despite Ethan's initial resistance, Emma began to notice small changes in his attitude. He seemed less rigid at the end of each meal, as if something about the care she put into each dish was softening his defenses. One afternoon, while preparing dinner, Emma ventured to ask, "Have you ever thought that, perhaps, eating could be more than a necessity? Something to enjoy?" Ethan, who was reviewing documents at the nearby counter, looked up at her thoughtfully. There was something about her question that made him hesitate before answering. "It's gone," he said finally, in an almost melancholy tone. "But that was a long time ago." Emma felt the emotional barrier he put up in the face of that memory, but decided not to press. Instead, she replied softly, maybe it's time to rediscover that pleasure. The next morning, Emma Carter was in Ethan's kitchen, cooking something she knew would make an impact. Almond pancakes with a light citrus syrup, decorated with lemon zest. It was something that reminded her of her childhood in small-town Vermont, where mornings were filled with the smell of fresh coffee and laughter around the table. She couldn't help but smile as the dough browned in the pan, the sweet aroma spreading throughout the impeccably organized kitchen. For Emma, cooking was more than a craft, it was a way to create memories and touch hearts. Ethan entered the kitchen, attracted by the aroma. He was impeccably dressed, as usual, but his eyes revealed a trace of curiosity. "Pancakes?" he asked, almost as if he was trying to understand the concept. "Yes," Emma replied, flipping the first pancake deftly. "An adapted version, of course. Something light, but with a touch of comfort." Ethan watched as she served the dish, with the pancakes stacked perfectly and a translucent syrup running down the top. He hesitated before tasting, his fork hovering over the food as if it were an important decision. As he took the first piece to his mouth, Ethan's expression changed. There was a softening in her posture, almost imperceptible but clear to Emma. He chewed slowly, as if tasting more than the food, perhaps the memory of something forgotten. "It's good," he said finally, but with a different tone. It wasn't just technical approval, there was something deeper, almost nostalgic. Emma took advantage of the moment of vulnerability to start a conversation. "You know, pancakes were a tradition at home. My mother made it on Sundays, and my father always said it was the best breakfast in the world. It was the only day of the week where we all sat together, without rushing." Ethan looked up at her, his expression softer. "It looks nice." She smiled. "And you? Any family traditions?" For a moment, Ethan seemed to withdraw into himself, his expression becoming distant. "My family wasn't exactly traditional. There was a lot of protocol, a lot of rules. It wasn't the kind of place for relaxed moments." Emma heard the hesitation in his voice and decided not to push him. Instead, she replied gently, "Well, at least you have it now." The days that followed were marked by a subtle but significant change in Ethan. He began spending more time in the kitchen while Emma worked, asking occasional questions about recipes or commenting on details about ingredients. One night, as she prepared a light risotto with fresh herbs, Ethan stood at the counter with a glass of water, watching her cut vegetables with precision. "Have you always wanted to be a chef?" he asked, voice filled with genuine curiosity. Emma paused for a moment, looking at him with a smile. "I always wanted to cook. But being a chef, that came later. When I was a child, I dreamed of opening a snack bar in my city. Something small, cozy. Why didn't you do that?" he asked, his voice less stiff than usual. She sighed, stirring her risotto as she spoke. "Life, I guess. My mother got sick when I was 15, and my father worked full-time to pay the bills. So, I moved to New York to try something bigger. But deep down, I think I still want that small, cozy place." Ethan listened attentively, something rare for him. Emma's honesty was disarming, and he realized he was beginning to see her as more than just a chef. She was someone with dreams, with a story. After a few seconds of silence, he said something that surprised even himself. "When I was a child, I used to run away to my grandparents' garden. It was the only place I could breathe, away from meetings and expectations." Emma looked at him, feeling the depth of that confession. "Are you still going there?" he asked, his voice soft. Ethan shook his head, almost wistfully. "No. I think it's easier to leave certain things in the past." She smiled gently. "Sometimes the past can be just what we need to remember who we are." As she served dinner, Ethan felt something he couldn't explain. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, someone had broken through his defenses, not with insistence, but with silent heat. That afternoon, the rain tapped softly against the picture windows of Ethan's apartment, covering Manhattan in a gray veil. Emma worked quietly in the kitchen, testing a new recipe for creamy pumpkin and ginger soup, perfect for the weather. As she slowly stirred the soup, an insistent thought troubled her. What made Ethan avoid emotional connections, even the simplest ones? Ever since she started working for him, Emma noticed that although Ethan was polite and sometimes even kind, there was an insurmountable wall around him. She felt like every smile or casual comment she managed to elicit from him was like finding hidden treasure. But what made him so isolated? Ethan was in the office next door, but the door between the two spaces was ajar. Emma could hear his voice in a harsher tone than usual. "No, it is not negotiable. If they cannot fulfill the terms, the contract is cancelled." After a brief pause, he continued, his tone growing colder. "I've seen this before. Broken promises never lead to anything." The words echoed in Emma's mind, filled with a weight that went beyond work. Something had happened to him. Something that had taught him to expect the worst from people. Later, during dinner, Emma decided to break the silence between them. "Today, you were different," he commented, serving the soup on Ethan's plate. He looked at her, intrigued. "Different how?" "More serious." "It seems like something from your past has appeared," she said, choosing her words carefully. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze becoming distant. For a moment, she thought he would ignore her question, but then he spoke. "The past has an annoying habit of never going away, Emma. That's why it's better not to depend on anyone." She hesitated, feeling the pain in his words. "Is this what you really believe?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before responding. "I once trusted someone. And I was betrayed. That was enough to learn that trust is a luxury that not everyone can afford." The silence that followed was as thick as the rain outside. Emma wanted to say something, anything that could ease the weight he was carrying, but words felt insufficient. Later, as he was washing the dishes, his mind returned to a vague memory, something from his childhood. An undefined figure, a boy, in a park. She couldn't remember the details, but there was a feeling of security associated with him, as if he had protected her. Emma shook her head, trying to dismiss the idea. Maybe it was just her imagination playing with her. But the feeling persisted, a pang of something she couldn't completely ignore. That night, as Ethan worked quietly in his office and Emma organized her suitcase of knives, they were both caught up in thoughts that seemed to echo each other, a silent desire to connect, but also the fear of opening a door that might be better. Leave closed. The night of the corporate dinner arrived surrounded by almost palpable tension. Ethan's apartment had been transformed into an elegant, sophisticated setting, with marble tables decorated with white flowers and sparkling silverware arranged like a work of art. Emma had been in the kitchen since the early hours of the afternoon, adjusting each dish with almost obsessive precision. Ethan entered the kitchen just before the guests arrived, looking impeccable in a dark gray suit but with a stern expression. "Everything in order?" he asked, emotionless, but Emma heard the slight hint of concern in his voice. She responded with a tired but confident smile. "Everything under control." Of course he wouldn't know how much of a lie that was. The weight of that dinner was on his shoulders. It was an opportunity to prove himself on a bigger stage, but also a test that could compromise his reputation. As the clock approached 7, the first guests began to arrive. Ethan received them with his controlled posture, but Emma noticed the traces of discomfort in his eyes whenever he had to interact for more than a few minutes. He was a master at hiding his emotions, but that night, the weight of pleasing investors seemed heavier than usual. In the kitchen, Emma moved like an organized storm, coordinating her small team of helpers as she finished the first courses. The menu was bold but carefully tailored to meet Ethan's demands and impress his guests' sophisticated palates. The first round of starters was served, seared scallops with pea puree and truffle oil. Initial feedback was positive, but a dry comment from one of the most influential investors reached the kitchen, like a blade cutting through the air. "It's good, but not surprising." Emma felt the impact of the criticism, but maintained her composure. There were more dishes to come, and she was determined to prove herself. However, the pressure increased, and each movement seemed to carry a greater weight. When the main course herb-crusted fish fillet with a saffron sauce was served, another comment reached his ears. A guest mumbled something about the presentation being too simple for such an important event. Ethan listened. He was sitting at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on his guest for a moment before he spoke, his voice calm but full of authority. "Simplicity is what highlights sophistication. The dish perfectly reflects the balance between flavors." The room was silent for a moment, and the guest, clearly surprised, did not respond. Ethan glanced at Emma as she left the kitchen to adjust a detail on the table, and his eyes seemed to say, "Trust yourself." But the final blow came with dessert. Emma had prepared a dark chocolate cake with a warm raspberry filling, accompanied by homemade vanilla ice cream. One of the investors, an informal food critic, commented loud enough for everyone to hear. "Predictable." Emma froze in the kitchen when she heard the words. As much as he tried to prepare himself emotionally for criticism, it pierced his confidence like a sharp knife. Ethan immediately noticed her hesitation when she entered the room to check on the progress of the job. He got up from the table, something he rarely did at events like this, and walked over to Emma. "Don't worry about them," he said in a low but firm tone as he placed his hand on her shoulder for a brief moment. "They don't know what they're talking about." This small show of support, public and so atypical for Ethan, did not go unnoticed by the guests. The silent gesture broke the ice in the room, and the murmurs of criticism began to subside. When dinner was over, Emma was exhausted but relieved. Ethan entered the kitchen, looking at her with a mixture of seriousness and something that looked like admiration. "You did an excellent job," he said. Emma smiled, but her voice still carried the doubt that had accompanied her throughout the night. Not everyone agreed. Ethan took a step forward, his expression softening. "Their opinion doesn't matter. What matters is that you did what you do best, and I'm satisfied. It was the first time Emma had seen Ethan speak so honestly. For a moment, the rigidity that always accompanied him was gone, revealing a man who understood the weight of expectations, but also knew how to recognize genuine effort. That night, as she gathered up her tools and prepared to leave, Emma noticed that there was something different about Ethan. He wasn't just a difficult customer, he was someone who was beginning to value more than the dishes she prepared. On that autumn afternoon, the sun filtered through the yellowing leaves of Central Park, casting soft shadows across the gravel path. Ethan wasn't the type to enjoy outings, but Emma's insistence on taking him to a local farmer's market to buy fresh ingredients convinced him to step out of his comfort zone. Walking alongside her, however, was surprisingly easy. She spoke animatedly about the importance of seasonal ingredients and how a good meal started with the right choice of products. Ethan listened to her, more interested in the infectious energy in her voice than the topic itself. They passed a busy square, where children played while dogs ran circles around their owners. Emma stopped suddenly, her expression changing to something distant, almost melancholy. "All good?" Ethan asked, noting the sudden change in mood. Emma hesitated before answering. "Yeah, just. This place looks familiar. It's strange." Ethan looked around, trying to understand. He also felt something vaguely familiar about the scenery. Then, as they walked further, something caught their attention, a small wooden bench next to a peaceful lake. He stopped abruptly, his hands balling into fists as a buried memory forcefully surfaced. Ethan found himself, years ago, sitting on that same bench. It was a similar afternoon, but with a grayer sky. He was just a boy, trying to escape the constant pressure of his home, when he heard muffled crying. When he turned around, he saw a small girl crouched near a tree. At that time, he hesitated before approaching. A large dog, on a loose leash, stood near her, and she was visibly shaking with fear. He clearly remembered what he said, "Don't worry. He can't hurt you." Now, standing in that same spot, Ethan felt the air running out of him. He looked at Emma, who was a few steps ahead, lost in her own thoughts. He whispered, almost without realizing it. "It was you." Emma turned around, confused. "What?" He stepped forward, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "You were that girl. In the park, many years ago." Emma blinked, trying to understand, as disjointed pieces of memory began to fit together. That boy. She remembered the kind words and young face that helped her calm down. She looked at Ethan, revelation written all over her face. "Was it you?" Ethan nodded, his voice low. "I remember. You were scared. I wanted to help her, but I never imagined I would meet her again." For a moment, the world around him seemed to disappear. Emma felt the weight of coincidence, or destiny, like a tangible force. It was surreal to think that the boy who comforted her on that long ago day was now the reserved man she was trying to understand. "Why didn't you ever mention this?" she asked, still trying to process. "I wasn't sure until now," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's strange. I always felt like there was something familiar about you." Emma gave a small smile, her emotions wavering between surprise and something deeper, something she didn't know how to describe. "I guess I should say thank you. You were my first memory of someone kind." Ethan looked away, his posture becoming a little stiffer, but his words betrayed his vulnerability. "And you were my first memory of normalcy. Something outside my home, where everything was control and expectation." The confession hung in the air, carrying a weight that they both felt. The connection between them, previously just professional and growing into friendship, now seemed intertwined by something greater, something that had resisted time and chance. As they returned to the market, the silence between them was different. It wasn't uncomfortable, but full of meaning. Each step seemed to resonate with the awareness that their lives were intertwined in a way neither could ignore. Ethan Blake's silence was deafening. Since the day of the reveal in the park, he had become more withdrawn, almost as if he was trying to erase the connection that had brought them together so unexpectedly. Emma felt it with every interaction. Despite his daily presence in his apartment, he seemed increasingly distant, deep in thought while maintaining a facade of normalcy. She tried not to let it affect her, but it was difficult. That morning, as she was chopping fresh herbs for lunch, Emma noticed that her hands were more tense than usual. She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. Why was he reacting like this? The revelation seemed to have triggered something deep in Ethan, but she didn't know how to deal with it. The truth was that she herself didn't know what to think. Ethan wasn't just her client or a complicated, distant man. He was now part of a memory that had defined a moment in his childhood, a moment of comfort in the midst of chaos. Ethan, in turn, watched Emma from afar, his heart filled with a mixture of conflicting emotions. He recognized the vulnerability she brought out in him, something he had avoided his entire adult life. He thought, how could someone so different, so open and full of life, connect with me? He looked away whenever she caught him staring, but he couldn't help the magnetism he felt. Still, the idea of allowing himself to feel something deeper terrified him. The betrayal years ago, from a person he had blindly trusted, was a scar he still hadn't been able to overcome. That afternoon, Emma decided to break the ice. "Ethan, I'm going to the store to pick up some things. I need you to tell me if there's anything specific you'd like for dinner." He looked up from his laptop, hesitating for a moment before responding with the neutral tone she was beginning to recognize as his armor. "No. Do what you think is best." Emma shook her head, frustrated with the answer. Why does he always hide behind this facade? He thought. But before she could leave, Ethan spoke again, his voice lower. "Wait." She stopped at the door, waiting for him to continue. Ethan stood up, running a hand through his hair as if trying to find the right words. "About what happened in the park." Emma held her breath. It was the first time he had mentioned it since the day of the revelation. "I don't know how to deal with this," he admitted, finally meeting her eyes. "I've been avoiding thinking about it because I don't know what it means." Emma stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Ethan, it doesn't have to mean anything you don't want it to mean. But it also cannot be ignored." He looked away, his shoulders falling slightly. "I am not used to dealing with connections, Emma. All I have learned in life is that trusting leads to hurt yourself." She completed it, cutting it gently. Ethan nodded, her expression loaded with a vulnerability she had never seen before. Emma approached another step, her heart beating hard. "I understand it's hard, but you're not alone in this. Maybe we can find it together. For a moment, she thought he would back down, but instead Ethan looked at her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "You don't know what you're saying, Emma. I am complicated." Emma smiled, though her eyes were shining with tears she refused to pour. "I know. And honestly, I am too." Ethan did not respond immediately, but something changed in his posture. He seemed lighter, as if her words had crossed the armor he wore so long ago. That night, while Emma prepared dinner and Ethan watched her from a distance, both felt that something fundamental had changed between them. The space between them was loaded with possibilities and also of fear. That morning, the Manhattan sky was covered with dense clouds, announcing imminent rain. Emma felt the weight of the day before with Ethan while carefully organized the ingredients on the kitchen countertop. Despite the casual tone she had tried to maintain, her words had been loaded with sincerity. She had exposed herself more than she intended, and now, while choking onions with accurate movements, she could not ward off the feeling of vulnerability that haunted her. Ethan has not appeared for breakfast, something unusual since she had started working for him. Usually it came around 8 hours and 30 minutes, impeccably dressed, ready for a meal that seemed more obligation than pleasure. But that morning, the chair empty at the table seemed to reflect the distance that he imposed not only on the world, but to her in particular. Why was he hiding? Emma tried to convince herself that she was just one of her usual barriers, but the memory of her expression the night before haunting her. He was broken, that was clear. But there was something more, something he seemed determined to keep buried. Determined not to let the silence grow even more, Emma cleaned her hands on her apron and went to Ethan's office. The door was ajar, and she saw him sitting on her leather armchair, staring at the window. The city stretched before him, but his eyes were focused on something beyond the horizon. With a light touch on the door, she caught her eye. "Ethan? Everything is fine?" He turned his head slowly, his gaze finding hers. For a moment Emma thought he would ignore her, but then he sighed, running his hand over his hair. "Yes, everything is fine. Only, many thoughts." Emma came in hesitant, feeling that there was something else. She was not the type who retreated before a barrier, especially when it was someone she was beginning to care. "Thoughts about yesterday?" he asked, his soft but firm voice. Ethan laughed without humor, a low and bitter sound. "You are more perceptive than I would like." She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorstop. "Someone needs to be." For a moment he looked at her as if he was deciding how far he could allow her to enter. Finally, he gestured to the chair in front of him. "Sit down." Emma obeyed, feeling the tension in the air. He got up and started walking around the office, his hands in the pockets of the suit while talking. "My life has never been simple. You have already noticed that. But what you may not know is that once I tried to be different. I tried to trust." Emma remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I was young, still building my career, and there was someone whom I trusted completely." Ethan stopped, staring at the window with a distant look. "She was a friend, a confidant. I thought she understood my struggles, my limitations. But she used it all against me." Emma felt her heart squeeze to hear the pain in her voice. He continued, the most serious tone. "She manipulated my words, my actions, for her own benefit. In the end, I lost a lot more than money or reputation. I lost the ability to believe in people." Ethan finally turned to face her, her eyes shining with a mixture of hurt and frustration. "That's why I keep people at a distance. Because, Emma, betrayal is too deep cut to completely heal. Emma absorbed her words, feeling the weight of each. She knew Ethan was opening more than he had ever done with anyone, and it made her realize the depth of her confidence in her. Do you think it's the only one who has scars? She said, her voice loaded with emotion. We all have, Ethan. But if you let it keep you from living, then who really won? Ethan was silent, his words hovering between them as an undisputed truth. That afternoon he finally emerged from the office and found Emma in the kitchen, working in silence. He approached hesitantly. Thanks. Emma looked at him, surprised. Why? Remembering me that there is still something that is worth fighting, he answered, his voice smoother than she had ever heard. The aroma of baking bread filled the small restaurant newly opened, mixing with the slight sound of laughs that escaped from the kitchen. Emma Carter, now officially owner of the hearth, had her hands covered with flour as she gently cut fresh herbs to finish a soup. The space, welcoming and enlightened, was just as it had dreamed, rustic wooden tables, wild flowers in simple jars, and a counter where customers could watch the culinary magic happens. Ethan Blake, with his sleeves of his shirt, was beside her, holding a bag of onions as if it were a monumental task. Do you really think this is a suitable job for a CEO? He asked, with a fun smile on his lips. Emma laughed, looking at him as she adjusted a pan over the stove. I think you're going very well. Also, it's good to see you out of a suit. He pretended out indignation, placing his hand over his chest. I sacrificed for you, and is this how I am rewarded? The words, though playful, carried an emotional weight they both felt deeply. Ethan had changed. He was no longer the man who hid behind rigid routines and invisible walls. Emma's presence in her life had not only softened her edges, she had transformed him, giving him something he never expected to find: purpose. While Emma finished the dishes for first lunch customers, Ethan watched her with a mix of admiration and gratitude. He thought of how, months ago, his life had been an endless sequence of predictable days, each identical to the previous one. Emma had entered as a ray of light, challenging her organized world, breaking her barriers and somehow making him believe again. Emma felt his eyes and stopped for a moment, turning to find her eyes. What it was? He asked, smiling, but slightly disconcerted by the intensity on his face. Nothing, he answered, shaking his head with a small smile. Just, I'm proud of you. The simple words made Emma's heart tighten. Ethan was not the type who distributed compliments for free, and heard them now meant more than he probably realized. Thank you, she said, her soft voice. But I wouldn't be here without you. Ethan stepped ahead, shortening the distance between them. You would be. You always had it inside you. I helped push a little. The two stayed there for a moment, the rest of the world crumble around. The noise of the restaurant door opening brought them back to reality, and Emma wiped her hands hastily on her apron before returning to action. Months passed, and the hearth became a success. The small restaurant not only attracted faithful customers, but also represented the heart of Emma and Ethan's journey together. One night, after the last client leaves and the silence filled the space, Emma and Ethan decided to cook something simple just for them. It was a ritual that had begun as a casual idea and quickly became one of the most precious moments of the day. This time it was a fresh pasta, something Emma loved to prepare. She mixed the ingredients while Ethan tried without much success use the roll of mass. This is ridiculous. How do you make it look so easy? He grunted, frowning in concentration. Emma laughed loudly, her laugh echoing through the empty space. Because I'm amazing, she answered, taking the roll from his hands and demonstrating the right movement. Ethan watched her with a soft smile. He loved these moments when she was completely on her element, without worry, just being herself. When the dough was ready, they prepared a simple sauce with fresh tomatoes, basil and garlic. Sitting together at the table, with the aroma of the dish surrounding them, Ethan raised his glass of wine. At a new beginning, he said, his fixed eyes on hers. Emma smiled, raising her cup. And to the fact that you finally learned to use a roll of mass. They toast, their laughs by mixing with the soft sound of a song that played in the background. Later, as they washed the dishes together, Emma looked at Ethan, her still wet hands. Do you know what else I learned from all this? Ethan raised an eyebrow, curious. What? That sometimes the most important things in life happen when we least expect it. He smiled, drying his hands before pulling her closer. You are right. And I'm grateful for that. The kiss that shared with her was full of silent promises. They were not perfect, but together they had found something more powerful than perfection, the ability to accept and build something new. While the restaurant's lights went out and the city continued its rhythm outside, the space they had created together remained full of life, hope and love. Our story for today comes to an end, friends, but before we say goodbye, I need your help to keep this rhythm of stories alive. If this story moved, inspired, or simply entertained you, don't hesitate to give this video a like. It's as simple as a click, but it means the world to us. Do you want more stories like this one? Then subscribe to Happiness of Love and don't forget to activate the notification bell so you never miss any of our new adventures. Remember, we have a new video every 2 days. Share this video with your friends and family, who knows? You might inspire someone to make a positive change in the world. Leave us a comment letting us know which part of the story touched your heart the most. We love reading your thoughts and connecting with you. And if you're watching this on your phone, don't forget to hit the hype button to show your enthusiasm and help us reach even more people with these inspiring stories. Thank you for being part of the Happiness of Love community. Your support is like the heartbeat of this channel, vital and full of life. Oh, and before you go, check out the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another amazing story you won't want to miss. See you in 2 days with another story that will take your breath away. Until then, keep the rhythm of love and inspiration alive, one beat at a time.